A heavy excavator tears into the asphalt on a busy street in Lower Manhattan in the spring of 2023. The machine bites down through the blacktop, through the concrete road base, and into the dark, damp earth below. The crew is digging a routine trench to lay modern fiber optic cables, expecting to find the usual tangle of iron gas mains and plastic conduits. But at a depth of about 8 feet, the steel teeth of the bucket scrape against something that does not belong in the modern grid. The operator cuts the engine. Down in the trench, half encased in the wet soil, is a massive log. It is perfectly straight, stripped of its bark, and bound at the joints by heavy, hand-forged iron rings. When the workers clear the mud away from the end of the timber, they see that the center of the tree has been perfectly, smoothly hollowed out. Water is still pooling inside the dark, circular void. It is a wooden pipe. And it is not an isolated piece of debris. It is connected to another log and another, running straight down the avenue directly beneath the skyscrapers, vanishing into the subterranean dark. When images of these wooden pipes hit the internet, they spark immediate and intense division. For many, these hollowed-out logs are a baffling impossibility. We are taught that modern plumbing is a relatively recent triumph, built of cast iron, copper, and modern synthetics. The idea that a vast, high-pressure water system could be constructed out of dead trees seems absurd. And because these wooden pipes are often found buried deep beneath layers of brick and modern utilities, sometimes 10 or 15 feet down, a growing movement of alternative researchers looks at these images and sees evidence of a suppressed timeline. They argue that early settlers arriving in the late 1700s and early 1800s lacked the industrial capacity to bore thousands of miles of perfectly straight holes through solid timber. To them, these pipes are the remnants of an older, highly advanced civilization, infrastructure that was not built by early Americans, but simply dug up, repurposed, and then deliberately covered over by a historical narrative designed to hide the truth of our past. So, what are we actually looking at when we pull a hollowed-out tree from the mud of a modern metropolis? Was it a myth, a primitive stopgap, or a memory of something much larger and more complex than we have been led to believe? To answer that, we will look at the engineering records that survive in the archives, at the physical evidence left in the soil, at a forgotten political scandal that changed the shape of an entire city, and at the sheer, terrifying desperation that drove people to tear down ancient forests and bury them beneath their feet. We are going to trace the history of a forgotten underground empire, and by the end, you will see exactly why these pipes were buried, why they were left to rot, and why the true story of how they were made is far more fascinating than any alternative theory. To understand why someone would go to the unimaginable effort of burying trees under a city, you have to understand the world as it was in the final decade of the 18th century. Picture the streets of a major eastern port city like Philadelphia or New York in the summer of 1798. The heat is suffocating. The streets are largely unpaved, turning to a toxic mud of horse manure, human waste, and rotting garbage every time it rains. There is no sanitation department. There are no underground sewers. People rely on shallow public wells for their drinking water, and those wells are positioned only feet away from open cesspools and butcher yards. The water drawn from these pumps is notoriously foul, often described by travelers of the time as tasting of decay. But bad taste was the least of their problems. In the late summer months, a horror descended on these cities that the inhabitants did not understand and could not stop. They called it the yellow fever. It would sweep through the packed neighborhoods, killing thousands in a matter of weeks. The wealthy would flee to the countryside, while the poor were left trapped in the stifling, disease-ridden streets. The medical science of the time blamed miasma, bad air rising from the filth and the stagnant water. While we know today that yellow fever was spread by mosquitoes breeding in that stagnant water, the people of the late 1700s only knew that the filth of their cities was killing them. They realized, with absolute existential dread, that if they did not find a way to bring massive quantities of clean, moving water into the heart of their cities, their civilization would simply collapse under the weight of its own disease. But how do you move millions of gallons of water across miles of land before the invention of industrial steel production? You do not have vast foundries capable of casting miles of heavy iron pipe. You do not have plastics. You do not have the modern supply chain. What you have is gravity, human muscle, and the single most abundant resource on the North American continent: old-growth forests. We tend to look back at the people of this era with a certain technological arrogance. We assume that because they did not have electricity or combustion engines, their engineering was crude. But the men who planned the early American water systems were brilliant mechanical minds. They understood fluid dynamics, they understood pressure, and they understood the exact physical properties of the materials they had at hand. They looked at the massive yellow pines and cedar trees surrounding their settlements and realized they did not need to invent a new material for pipes. Nature had already provided millions of them. They just needed to take the core out of the tree. If you enjoy stories the history books quietly skipped, consider subscribing because this channel lives on them. Because what followed was an engineering mobilization of a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend today. We're going to look at the exact mechanical process they used to bore through solid timber, at the massive pumping stations that forced water through these wooden veins, at the political corruption that left some of these systems to rot, and at why the modern discovery of these pipes challenges everything we think we know about the ground we walk on. And this is where the story moves from historical context into the physical reality of the dirt. Because decades after the yellow fever epidemics, the archives show the creation of corporate and municipal entities with one goal: to pipe fresh water into the homes of the living. Let us look closely at how a wooden pipe was actually made, because the sheer mechanical genius of it is the first piece of evidence that challenges both the skeptics who call them primitive and the alternative theorists who call them impossible. According to the engineering manuals and surviving municipal records of the early 1800s, the process was a marvel of pre-industrial mass production. Contractors would fell massive, straight, yellow pine or cedar trees, selecting logs that were between 10 and 15 feet long and about 1.5 feet in diameter. These logs were then placed on heavy wooden cradles. To bore the hole, they used a massive iron auger, essentially a giant drill bit. In the earliest days, this was done by hand. Two men would turn a massive crossbar attached to the auger, slowly grinding their way through the heartwood of the log. It was agonizing, back-breaking work, but very quickly, water-powered and eventually steam-powered boring mills were established. The log would be strapped to a carriage and slowly fed into a spinning iron bit powered by a water wheel. The precision was startling. They could bore a perfectly straight hole, anywhere from 2 to 6 inches in diameter, straight through a 12-foot log. But a pipe is useless if it cannot connect to another pipe. So, at one end of the log, the craftsman would shave down the outside of the wood to form a tapered cone. At the other end, they would hollow out a wider, bell-shaped opening. To lay the pipeline, workers in the trench would take the tapered end of one log and ram it into the bell end of the next. As water flowed through the system, the wood would absorb the moisture and swell. This swelling caused the joints to lock together so tightly that they became virtually watertight. To prevent the ends from splitting under the immense pressure of the swelling wood, blacksmiths forged heavy iron bands and hammered them around the joints. Notice the brilliance of this. They used the natural properties of the wood, its tendency to expand when wet, to solve the problem of sealing the joints. Records show that in cities like Philadelphia, the ambition was staggering. In the early 1800s, Philadelphia constructed the Fairmount Waterworks, an architectural and engineering masterpiece on the banks of the Schuylkill River. Using massive steam engines and later giant water wheels, they pumped millions of gallons of fresh river water up into a reservoir built on top of a hill. From there, gravity forced the water down into a sprawling subterranean network of wooden pipes. By the 1820s, Philadelphia had laid over 40 miles of wooden pipes beneath its streets, connecting to hydrants, businesses, and wealthy private homes. But here is where the historical record encounters the physical anomalies that fuel so much modern debate. When modern construction crews dig up these pipes, they do not just find a few logs. They find complex intersections. They find wooden valves made of fitted blocks. They find iron shutoff gates integrated directly into the wood. And most troubling to some observers, they find these pipes buried extremely deep. It is not uncommon for a crew in Boston or New York to dig 10 or 12 feet down through layers of historical debris before hitting a wooden water main. For those who question the official historical narrative, this depth is the smoking gun. Alternative historians point out that a society relying on horse-drawn carts and hand shovels would not dig a trench 12 feet deep to lay a water pipe, especially in the rocky soil of Manhattan or the dense clay of the eastern seaboard. The labor cost would be astronomical. Furthermore, the sheer volume of wood required, the industrial capacity needed to bore tens of thousands of logs, and the geographical spread of these findings across the entire continent seemed to defy the timeline of early colonial expansion. To these researchers, the official story does not add up. They propose that these wooden networks belonged to an earlier, undocumented society that inhabited the Americas long before the accepted timeline. They argue that a cataclysmic event, often referred to in alternative circles as a mud flood, buried the original ground level of these ancient cities. When the later settlers arrived, they simply found these pipes already buried in the deep earth, repurposed what they could, and claimed the engineering as their own. This brings us to a critical crossroads in the investigation. We are left with two distinct narratives. One says that early Americans engineered and buried a continent-spanning network of wooden plumbing using steam and water power. The other says that the physical evidence, the extreme depth, the complexity, and the strange suddenness of the pipe networks points to an inherited infrastructure from a forgotten world. Every time a city tries to close the book on its history, one piece of evidence pulled from the mud pulls the case back open. To understand what really happened in the dark earth beneath our streets, we have to look past the isolated photographs of dug-up logs and examine the full context of the evidence itself, piece by piece. Let us methodically investigate the claims of the alternative timeline first. The argument rests heavily on the depth of the finds. Why would men with hand shovels bury pipes 12 feet underground? It is a valid question that deserves a serious look, because if you assume the ground level has always been the same, a 12-foot trench makes no economic or engineering sense. But history is not static, and neither is the geography of a living city. Look at the municipal records of cities like Chicago, New York, and Boston from the middle of the 19th century. As these cities grew, they realized their original elevations were too low to allow for proper drainage, leading to chronic flooding and disease. In response, they undertook massive, radical terraforming projects. In Chicago, they famously jacked up entire blocks of buildings using screw jacks and filled in the streets beneath them, raising the level of the city by over 10 feet. In Manhattan, hills were leveled and valleys were filled in with millions of tons of rubble and earth to create the flat grid we know today. Boston systematically filled in its surrounding tidal flats, creating entirely new neighborhoods out of the water. When you read the grading reports from that era, the mystery of the deep pipes begins to unravel. The men who laid those wooden logs in the year 1800 did not dig a 12-foot trench. They dug a trench 3 or 4 feet deep, just below the frost line, so the water inside would not freeze in the winter. They laid their pipes and covered them up. But 50 or 60 years later, the city came along and dumped 8 feet of fill dirt on top of that original street level to grade a new road. The pipes did not sink, and they were not buried by an ancient cataclysm. The city simply grew upward over the top of them. But depth is only one part of the mystery. The other part is the strange, almost secretive nature of some of these networks, particularly in New York. Why are there so many abandoned, poorly mapped wooden pipes in Manhattan? And why do they seem to follow no logical grid? Here, the history becomes far stranger than any alternative theory. If you look at the archives of New York State from 1799, you will find a charter for a company created by Aaron Burr, the man who would famously go on to kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel. Burr used the public panic over the yellow fever epidemic to push a bill through the state legislature, creating the Manhattan Company. The stated purpose of the company was to provide clean water to the city of New York. But Burr was a politician with a hidden agenda. He slipped a vaguely worded clause into the charter that allowed the company to use its surplus capital for financial transactions. The water company was a Trojan horse. Burr's real goal was to create a bank to rival Alexander Hamilton's financial monopoly. And it worked. The Manhattan Company went on to become one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world, eventually evolving into what we know today as J.P. Morgan Chase. But they still had a legal obligation to provide water. So, to maintain their banking charter, the Manhattan Company laid a network of wooden pipes across the city. According to civic records and complaints from the era, they did the absolute minimum required by law. They laid miles of cheap, shallow wooden pipes. They did not tap into the pristine rivers outside the city. They simply pumped water from a local, contaminated pond called the collect pond. The water they delivered through their wooden pipes was often diseased and foul. They laid the pipes haphazardly just to prove they were expanding the network, while pouring all their real resources into their banking operations. This forgotten political fraud explains so much of the physical evidence found today. It explains why some of the wooden pipes beneath New York seem poorly planned, why they do not follow modern logic, and why they were so quickly abandoned. It was never about creating a lasting infrastructure. It was a cynical political maneuver written in wood and buried in the dirt. And yet, you cannot judge the entire continent by the fraud of one company, because just a few hours south in Philadelphia, the wooden pipe system was the exact opposite. It was the pride of the city. The Fairmount Waterworks was internationally famous, visited by Charles Dickens, who marveled at its cleanliness and power. The wooden pipes there were laid with immense care. So why did both systems, the fraudulent network in New York and the masterful network in Philadelphia, suffer the exact same fate? Why did they both vanish from public memory, leaving only rotting logs in the dark? Everything now points in one direction. The archives, the grading reports, the political scandals, and the physical reality of the wood itself all agree. And the thing they agree on reveals a harsh truth about the limits of human engineering and the relentless pressure of progress. The answer to the mystery of the wooden pipes is not that they were built by a lost civilization. The answer is that they were a brilliant, desperate technological bridge that simply could not survive the world they helped create. Consider the physics of a wooden pipe. As long as the water is flowing at a steady, low pressure, a hollowed-out log is an incredibly durable vessel. The wood stays saturated, preventing rot, and the iron bands hold the joints tight. For decades, this system worked. It saved lives. It allowed early American cities to grow beyond the limits of their polluted local wells. But that very growth became the enemy of the wooden pipe. As the cities expanded, buildings grew taller. A 3-story building required more water pressure than a 1-story house. The newly formed fire departments demanded high-pressure hydrants to fight the massive blazes that routinely threatened to burn wooden cities to the ground. To meet this demand, the cities upgraded their pumping stations, installing massive steam engines capable of forcing water through the system at unprecedented pressures. And that is when the underground empire began to tear itself apart. Wood has a limit. When you force high-pressure water through a pine log, the water searches for the weakest point. According to maintenance records from the 1830s and 40s, the cities were dealing with constant, catastrophic blowouts. The wooden pipes were splitting open under the streets, turning roads into sinkholes. Furthermore, as the population increased, the amount of raw sewage seeping into the ground increased. If a wooden pipe lost pressure, even for a moment, the vacuum could suck the contaminated groundwater through the porous wood and into the drinking supply. The wooden pipes, designed to stop disease, were now in danger of spreading it. The era of wood had reached its hard physical boundary. By the 1840s, metallurgical technology had finally caught up to the needs of the city. Foundries were now capable of mass-producing heavy cast iron pipes. New York undertook the staggering construction of the Croton Aqueduct, a massive masonry and iron system that brought pristine water from miles upstate. Philadelphia and Boston followed suit, ripping up their main lines and replacing them with iron. But what did they do with the hundreds of miles of wooden pipes already in the ground? This is where the two stories finally meet, and it explains exactly why we are still digging them up today. When a modern city replaces a utility, they often dig up the old pipe to lay the new one in the same trench. But in the mid-19th century, labor was still overwhelmingly manual, and digging trenches was brutally expensive. The wooden pipes were worthless. They could not be melted down and recycled like iron. They could not be burned for firewood because they were waterlogged and often coated in tar or pitch. So the engineers made a decision of pure, cold efficiency. They left them. They dug new trenches for the iron pipes parallel to the old ones, or they graded new dirt over the streets and laid the iron on top. They simply disconnected the water flow to the wooden logs, abandoned them in the dark, and walked away. Without the constant flow of fresh water, many of the shallower pipes dried out and crumbled into dust. But the pipes buried deep beneath the water table, trapped in the anaerobic mud where oxygen could not reach them, did not rot. They sat there in suspended animation, perfectly preserved in their watery graves, while the cities above them grew from brick towns into steel metropolises. We cannot know the exact history of every single log pulled from the ground today. The records are too fragmented, and the municipal maps from 2 centuries ago are too incomplete. But of every explanation ever offered, this is the only one that leaves nothing unaccounted for. The deep burial is explained by street grading. The immense scale is explained by the desperation of the epidemics. The sudden abandonment is explained by the transition to cast iron. After everything, the theories of lost empires, the shock of the modern construction workers, the political machinations of Aaron Burr, it all comes down to this one quiet truth. These wooden pipes are not the remnants of an alien past. They are the discarded scaffolding of our own civilization. And that is the quiet weight of it. Not a lost secret hidden by some vanished race, but ordinary human brilliance, powerful enough to outlast empires and fragile enough to be forgotten in a single generation. But the answer is not really where this story ends, because what it tells us about ourselves is the part that lingers. When we look at a hollowed-out tree trunk dragged from a trench in Manhattan, our first instinct is to view it as an anomaly, a bizarre glitch in the matrix of modern infrastructure. We like to think that knowledge and progress only move forward in a straight line, and that the ground beneath our feet is a solid, fully understood foundation. But the survival of the wooden pipes is proof that it is not. It proves that a society can mobilize its greatest minds, harvest its oldest forests, build a continent-spanning network that literally keeps millions of people alive, and then forget it completely in less than a century. The people walking the streets in 1920 had no idea they were walking over the wooden logs laid by their great-grandparents. Entire systems, refined over generations, can vanish from public memory the moment a new technology makes them obsolete. And it can happen to us just as easily as it happened to them. Everything you know how to do, every system you rely on to bring water to your tap and electricity to your home, exists only because it is currently useful. The moment it stops being useful, it will be abandoned in the dirt, just like the pine logs of Philadelphia. These wooden pipes are a monument to the terrifying speed of human amnesia. Think back to that excavator in the modern city, pulling a dripping, iron-bound log from the earth. Look at that image again now. It is not strange anymore. It is a mirror. Sometime in the distant future, someone is going to dig up a bundle of our fiber optic cables or the rusted shell of a subway car, and they are going to wonder who we were and how we managed to build such things before the world changed again. So here is my question for you. What invisible infrastructure, what modern technology that we use every single day do you think will be completely forgotten and buried in the dirt 200 years from now? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think, because the comments under these videos are half the reason I make them. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones the history books quietly skipped, the mysteries hiding right beneath the pavement, then subscribe. That is the only way you will catch the next one, and there are stranger ones coming. If this investigation kept you here to the end, leaving a like genuinely helps more people find it, and it is the whole reason channels like this survive. Thank you for staying with me all the way through. Keep questioning the ground you walk on, and I will see you in the next one.